Sometimes when we talk about knives, we miss the mark. We get so hung up on what design looks nicest, what handle material patina is the best, and perhaps most notably, what steel will give us the best performance. All of these traits are important, but we mustn't forget that a knife is designed first and foremost to cut. Today, I'm going to tell you about the single trait that has the most to do with your knife's ability to cut: geometry. For the purposes of this video, the cross-section of a blade has three important parts. First is the spine, the thickest part of the blade. Second is the edge, the thinnest. Between them is the grind and the taper from the thick spine to the thin edge. Every knife has these parts, and how they are executed has a significant impact on how the knife will cut, and it all comes down to good old physics. Edges work by creating as small an edge radius as possible. This focuses all the pressure of you pushing on the knife into a tiny area until that pressure is more than the material can bear. To escape it, the material tears along the points of pressure. The smaller the points of pressure, the cleaner and easier the cut. This knife is brand new and factory sharp, while this knife is super dull. I'm going to push cut through paper against a cutting board with both of them, and then we'll look at both cuts under a microscope. You see how much neater the cut with the sharp knife is, while the dull knife made a cut that's a bit more jagged? That's because the dull knife has a lot more surface area on its edge radius, so it had a wider plane to tear along. The sharper the knife, the cleaner the cut, right? Not necessarily. Let's try the same test, but with an apple. The sharp knife absolutely bodied this apple. It looks more like it was split than cut. But the dull knife did a much nicer job. How can this be? The answer is not in the geometry of the edge, but in the geometry of the spine. Physics says it will take more force to cram a thick piece of steel through an apple than a thin piece of steel, and physics does not lie. Was the thicker knife sharper? Yes. Was its first incision into the apple cleaner than the dull knife? Probably. But because it's just so darn thick, it wedged the apple apart at the end, while the thinner, albeit duller knife was still cutting. At this point, you may feel inclined to say, thinner is better because it cuts better. But don't be so hasty. The pendulum swings in the other direction too, and there are two big reasons to avoid knives that might be too thin. First is durability. If you're only cutting soft tissues like a hunter or a surgeon, you can go about as thin as you want. That's why scalpel blades are usually less than 0.5 millimeter thick. But when you cut things that are a bit more stubborn, like wood or zip ties, you run the risk of chipping your edge or even snapping your knife entirely. You want to pick a knife that is robust enough to handle whatever work you put it through. Second is splitting power. Sometimes you don't want to cut all the way through something. You want it to fall apart sooner and save you some time and energy. Here we have a piece of firewood, and I'm going to baton through it with both knives from earlier, and we'll see who comes out on top. I had to beat the thinner knife all the way through the log because it wasn't thick enough to just split it. But Big Chungus over here, sometimes thickness is your friend. It all depends on what you're trying to cut. But even knives of equal thickness can perform wildly different because of their grind. A knife's grind can be thought of like the entrance to this bank. A short, abrupt grind is kind of like this staircase. It gets whatever is being cut from one side to the other quick, but it's pretty difficult. But a long, gradual grind is more like a wheelchair ramp. It gets whatever is being cut from one side to the other smooth and easy, but it takes a bit longer. Which is better? Well, it depends. If you slice through a lot of packaging, that thicker staircase-like edge will bind up on things and will be a bit more difficult to cut with. A large portion of this comes from these ridges found where the flats meet the grind and where the grind meets the edge, which we call speed bumps. These ridges give a lot of extra friction in the cut, especially the ones near the spine. For sheer slicing power, you want your grind to be a bit more gentle and have a taper more like the wheelchair ramp. It can be used to minimize the prominence of speed bumps. You'll also want to keep in mind your coating, as that can introduce friction, but that's a story for another day. Kitchen knives accomplish this by being really wide in the blade and employing a full flat grind, giving you a straight line from edge to spine with no speed bumps from the grind. This grind is more time and tool intensive, so to save money on abrasives, some companies sorry about that, will instead give you a big, long, flat blade with an abrupt, hollow grind at the edge, which gives you a giant speed bump and inhibits slicing power. That's why I recommend kitchen knife shoppers opt for something with a wide blade and a full flat grind. Even if it's dull, that knife will still slice pretty well. The undisputed king of slicing grinds, though, is the convex grind, because it has no speed bumps at any point in the blade. Even if they're thick, they slice cleanly with surprisingly little effort. But what if you're not cutting so deep into something, so slicing power isn't all that important, and what you're cutting is a bit tougher than food? That's where some of the other grinds come in handy. For example, the Scandi grind is basically just an edge ground straight onto the blade without a grind at all. This is great for splitting things, and as you carve with it, the thickness behind the edge pushes the material away. Scandi grinds are without equal for wood carving, which is why they're so popular on bushcraft knives. That hollow grind I spoke ill of earlier has some great uses too. That inward curve creates a super thin edge that is great for shallow slicing cuts like skinning and shaving. Hollow grinds are also great for narrow blades because they can quickly taper from a thick spine to very thin behind the edge. Speaking of, within some limitations, you can put any edge angle you like on your knife. Just decide on what angle you want, hold the edge at that angle, and go to town on a sharpener until your edge is at your preferred angle. A narrow edge has a few benefits. Firstly, it has much better edge retention. As the apex wears away, the space behind the apex is narrower than with a more obtuse edge angle, which helps it feel sharper for longer. Second, because it's a thinner angle, it bites deeper than the more obtuse edges with less effort. Also, the narrower the edge angle, the less of a speed bump you get where the edge meets the grind. The biggest name in narrow edges is Benchmade's Select Edge, which comes from the factory sharpened and polished at 14 degrees per side. That's thinner than most kitchen knives, and it cuts incredibly well. So well that it punishes even the slightest carelessness. I should know. I have a few Select Edge scars of my own, including this rad adjustable weighted balisong that just cut the living daylights out of my finger. Go find out more on the YouTube. I did it again! Ah! More obtuse edges have a few benefits as well. While they don't bite as well and get dull faster, they are much more resistant to chipping. These edges are perfect for choppers, axes, machetes, and anything that cuts hard and fast. So which edge profile is right for you? As with all of these things, that depends. But whatever you go with, what's going on behind the edge should not be overlooked. When we say behind the edge, we refer to this section of grind where it meets the edge bevel. Listen carefully. A knife's ability to slice something is determined more by the steel behind the edge than by the edge itself. Don't believe me? My friend Alex from Outdoors 55 is an expert knife maker and sharpener. To prove just how important behind the edge geometry is, he ground his Spyderco Manix 2 to a much thinner edge at only 0.008 of an inch behind the edge. And before he actually put an edge back on the blade, he diced an onion. From the way the knife handled it, you'd think it was some crazy hair-splitting edge, but no. All it was really, really, really thin behind the non-existent edge. The point of his video was that is too thin, and he proved it by showing that his edge started to chip, but his point stands. Behind the edge thickness matters a lot. Too thin and your edge loses stability. Too thick and your knife can't cut worth a dang. Once again, you've got to find that happy medium. And once you've found it, your troubles aren't over. In our sharpeners video from a few months ago, we showed that when you sharpen your knife, you are removing material from the edge bevel. As you remove that material, the edge moves further and further up the blade. Every time you sharpen, your edge gets just a little bit thicker behind it. Heck, if you jump on the narrow edge angle bandwagon too soon, you'll end up like this knife. The person, who shall not be named, that sharpened this knife jumped right on, and just look at it. It will pop hairs all day long, but it binds up when cutting paper or cardboard because of how thick it is behind the edge. This is where that hollow grind comes to save the day. The inward curve of the blade gives you a good long section of nearly parallel grind lines, so you can sharpen your knife many, many times to acute angles and retain basically the same behind the edge thickness. That's why you see hollow grinds on a lot of heirloom quality knives like Buck and Chris Reeve. They're made to perform for multiple lifetimes, and that means a lot of sharpening. If you're knife shopping, you should know that there is no such thing as a perfect knife. Every knife will be good at something and be bad at something else. So ask yourself, what do I plan to cut the most? And carefully choose your features from there. When you're considering a knife, go over its specifications. There, you'll find information on its blade thickness and width. If you're feeling like an overachiever, You can bust out the old slide rule and trigonometrically calculate the angles of the edge and grind bevels, but you don't need to. The thinner and broader the blade, the taller the grind, and the wider the visible edge, the more slicey your knife will be. The thicker and narrower the blade, shorter the grind, and less visible the edge, the more splitty the knife will be. If you need a point of reference, take whatever knife you have near you, be it a kitchen knife, a folder, a fixed blade, etc., and ask yourself what you want more of. Is this knife too delicate, too tanky, not slicey enough, etc.? Measure it if you need to and compare it to knives at Blade HQ. This will help you identify the perfect knife for your cutting needs. And when you combine cutting performance suited to your lifestyle and a design that speaks to you, you'll probably find your new favorite, albeit imperfect, knife. But be warned, this is a dangerous path to walk. Before long, you'll start picking up your knives and thinking, this would be perfect for a camp out in a boreal forest. Its Scandi grind is great for carving green pine, and it's just thick enough for delimbing those branches overhead. But I'm not going camping in a boreal forest, I'm going backpacking through alpine meadows. And this is way too thick behind the edge to cleanly harvest wildflowers. Guess I need a new knife. And when you need a knife, the team at Blade HQ is here to help you find the perfect one for you. We'll see you on the next one.